Hi there, thanks ever so much for joining us today. This panel today is exploring new ways of working across our organisations and with our partners in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we're exploring is how organisations have changed ways of working, what already exists in the world in terms of expertise and practice that we might borrow from as a cultural sector. And then I think we're going to have a bit of a think about how as organisations we might consciously decide how to reset or reframe the ways that we work with colleagues and partners. In this panel, we've got a number of wonderful colleagues. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask them to introduce themselves, and then I'll move on to chair a conversation around this topic. So could I ask Michelle, first of all, to introduce herself, and then I'll go to Hannah, Jeannie and Becky. Michelle.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, I'm Michelle Taylor, and I'm Director for Change at Ramps on the Moon. We're an Arts Council-funded consortium of 6 mid-scale mainstream theatres and Grey Eye Theatre Company. And we're all about enriching the stories that we tell by raising the visibility of deaf, disabled people in mainstream theatre. That means that we are absolutely centrally about changing working practices. Yeah, that's why I'm excited to explore this topic.
Thank you, Michelle. Hannah.
I'm Hannah Cornick, and I have a background of 30 years of working in broadcast TV in factual genre. So I started as a journalist, became a programme maker, and then started to lead teams to make series. I'm also an executive coach and leadership trainer, and I've just been involved for the first month of lockdown in designing and delivering a month's worth of training called Free Training for Freelancers. Not exactly an innovative title, but one that did what it actually said it was going to do for the freelance production community. So I suppose my background in production has meant that I've always worked with remote teams, because whether I was one myself or working with people on location, and then particularly in the last obviously few months, that's been a very relevant way of working for the communities that I'm part of.
Great, thanks very much, Hannah. Jeannie.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Scott. I'm a People Make It Work associate, and I've been working as a consultant for quite a number of years, specialising in organisational change and helping organisations plan for restructure or thinking about new ways of working. So originally I started as a publisher, but I've been working across the arts sector for a long time, which means I've been working with every kind of arts organisation, all sorts of different sizes and scales, and seeing how they work and how they could maybe work a bit more effectively. Not necessarily better in terms of doing things right, but actually what is effective for those organisations. And I've most recently, I suppose, have been running a distributed organisation, so I've been managing that at a national level as well. So looking forward to bringing some of that learning into these sessions.
Thanks, Jeannie. And Becky.
Hi everybody, so I'm Becky Chapman. I'm Executive Director of Diverse City, and we are a producing organisation modelling and celebrating equality and diversity in the arts. We are an Arts Council MPO, and we have been a distributed organisation for about the last 9 years, and we work across the Southwest largely in terms of our workforce and nationally in terms of our touring. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. So the first question that I thought we might explore is what we've noticed happening in organisations over the last couple of months. What sort of new working practices have you seen emerging, perhaps for the first time in some organisations? What makes you optimistic? What makes you fearful about that emerging practice? Who'd like to start that? Maybe you, Michelle?
Sure, yeah, blimey. There's a lot, isn't there? I mean, perhaps most obviously, people working from home. Who haven't worked from home before, for organisations where people haven't worked from home before. So you've got both kind of sides of the equation, if I can look at it in that way, doing something they're not used to doing, managing from home, being managed from home, being effective from home, alongside colleagues who may not be working. So potentially with increased workloads and so on. So there's all of that. And of course, there's within theatre, the way in which lots and lots of work has been put online, again, by organisations that haven't necessarily done that before, and being consumed online, digitally, by people who haven't necessarily done that before. So loads just within those two categories, loads of stuff. What makes me fearful is that a lot of that has been done on the fly, obviously, necessarily, and potentially therefore not done as effectively as it might have been done. And it's also leaving a lot of people behind. So sometimes practices around equality and diversity haven't been what they might have been. We're not seeing huge amounts of diverse work in terms of theatre online. There is some, but not huge amounts. Some of the work that's out there has not been, for instance, captioned or interpreted or audio described. So there's that stuff. But what makes me optimistic, and this is actually bigger, what makes me optimistic is that it seems to me that literally within the space of 2 weeks, theatres, which are the kind of organisations that I'm working most closely with at the moment, but across the cultural industries, demonstrated and exercised huge amounts of innovation, that literally overnight the way organisations worked had to change. And we did it, they did it, in such brilliant ways. And as well as that, tethered to that, that there are ways of working that we are now doing as a matter of course that can work brilliantly for disabled and deaf people and all sorts of people who haven't previously haven't had an equal role and an equal opportunity to contribute to the cultural industries. So I feel really optimistic about this. This is a real opportunity to do the reset that the cultural industries has been saying for a number of years now it wants to do. And I feel really optimistic about that.
Great, thank you. Who else would like to talk about kind of new working practices that you've noticed, that you've witnessed?
I think I quite like. Oh, sorry, Hannah, you carry on if you want.
No, I was going to say, I think the thing that I just wanted to pick up a little bit on what Michelle was saying around that connectivity and actually the inclusivity. The freelance community is, generally speaking, quite a fractured community by its very nature. And I think that what I've noticed in the Free Training for Freelancers initiative that I was involved in is that it's been a great leveller at some level. I'm also an out of London worker, and whatever talk is talked, the walking of the walk around out of London, certainly in broadcasting, is less effective than the ambition. And I think that one of the things that's happened is that there's been a real inclusivity, that it hasn't really mattered where you live, and there's been a real sense of connection, but only if it's been considered and thought about and strategized to be as such. But in that experience of the Free Training for Freelancers, it really was a very inclusive and empowering experience, I think, for a lot of people, because it sort of leveled the playing field around that sort of power balance around geography. So I think I just wanted to add to that, the positive side, the optimistic. If we can hold on to a small number of learnings that come out of this experience, those would be the ones that I'd want to see replicated.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd quite like, just picking up both on what Michelle and Hannah have just said, is that kind of optimism for really good change to come out of this, not just for sort of freelancers or for individuals, but actually for even within organizations in terms of creating opportunities. And I think particularly because we work in a sector that has such a high volume of charitable structures, which in themselves can tend to be quite risk averse suddenly when they get into looking at how they organize themselves. But also dominated by small to medium-sized organizations where for people getting into careers, it can sometimes be quite difficult to progress that career within that organization, even if it's one that you absolutely love, that you can get to a point where it's very difficult to move on because people tend to, there are fewer opportunities in those organizations. And you either, as an organization owner, you end up losing that skill, or you're frustrated, you end up sometimes with frustrated staff who aren't allowed to or don't have the capacity to lead or do something different. And I think one of the things that this has shown us over the last few weeks is different voices appearing within organizations who have capacity and capabilities that would otherwise have been missed. And so there's an opportunity here, I think, to put structures or projects or pilots in place for people to really upskill and to reward and empower voices within organizations that maybe would have taken quite a long time or might have been quite difficult to have implemented before in a consensual way, getting everybody to agree to these changes or other people sort of taking charge in certain situations. So I think that's a really positive thing that we need to find ways to keep hold of.
And Becky.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing I've really noticed is, I was really picking up on what Hannah was saying, but whereas previously, I might have occasionally attended an 8:30 What Next meeting in London at the Young Vic in a very crowded room with maybe, I don't know, 50 people. Most recently, those What Next gatherings have been hundreds and hundreds of people. And similarly, we're based in, our company is a Dorset registered company. So the freelance artistic workforce has been really gathering in force on regular meetings, and that kind of level of access, let alone access for people who are disabled, who are facing geographical barriers, it's just been phenomenal. And I think that what I've noticed is that it's extended, a bit like Jeannie was saying, into our organisation, so that whereas previously I think that as an organisation we might have been very specific about who was required at what meeting, for what purpose, at what time, we've tended much more to take the tack of, if you think you've got something to offer, and if you think you have this project affects you or impacts you in any way, come. So meetings have become much more open, and there's a much more democratic sense of access to the whole organisation and the big picture. And I think, again, picking on what Jeannie's just said, that we're definitely, as an organisation, recognising all the capabilities of our teams. So when people are not just restricted to their job description, but someone who might be X is actually pivoting and doing something completely different, or building on a skill that was previously not really embedded in their job. And I think that's really interesting in terms of what Jeannie says in terms of progression and leadership, because it means different people, for us, are leading in our organisation. So someone who might otherwise, for example, a very young content creator for social media, is now very much leading on our digital output and how we distribute and how we gather our digital output. So that's been really freeing, I would say.
Thank you so much. I think in this conversation, it's probably worth us making a distinction between the ways that we're working within our organisations and with partners, and the ways in which we're making work for audiences and communities. And that latter piece is part of another strand of investigation that we're doing at People Make It Work and with Change Creation. And whilst they overlap an awful lot, in this conversation, I think, given how big that both those topics are, we might focus on, to the extent we can, the piece that's around how we work together. In that context, there's a sense, isn't there, that like of recent converts believing that they've invented this area of work, So what can we learn from other sectors and organisations, communities that have experienced, distributed and virtual, remote working and practices in the past? Where's that expertise, and what does that tell us about how we might do this really well?
I was going to say that I think what I've really noticed is that, I mean, although we've been doing distributed work for a very long time, we work very closely in partnership with a lot of organisations, and we have, one partner in particular that we work with, very close relationship with our company Extraordinary Bodies, which is an integrated circus company that tours nationally. And what I've noticed is that the novelty of this new time has actually exhausted a lot of our partners. And one of the things that I think they are beginning to understand is that this level of distribution and remote working, whilst it brings with it a lot of flexibility and kind of openness and maybe democracy, it also brings with it a need for an incredible level of structure and actually quite a lot of discipline, in order that people do not feel this uncontrollable urge to be in endless Zoom meetings. And by that, I suppose what I mean is that, so for example, one of the things that we have that is absolutely essential to our distributed methodology is we have someone who is absolutely responsible for making sure that all the platforms, we all know what the platforms are, what different platforms are used for, how we use them, a completely transparent filing system, so everything is accessible to everyone. The calendar is queen. I mean, the kind of rigor of the structures that we use is critical to the flexibility that then we all can enjoy. And I think it's that I've really noticed our partners not being able to put in place very quickly. We've got it in place, so we're really benefiting from that. And so for example, my email is suddenly out of control because people don't know how to control their communication in a way that is kind of effective and helpful, and therefore I think things are getting missed and actually being quite inefficient. So that would be a kind of observation from my side.
Michelle?
Yeah, off the back of that, I think it's really interesting because that's the flip side, isn't it, Becky, of what you were saying about if you think you've got something to contribute to this meeting, then please come and contribute it. That because of the history of culturally how our industries work, then there's the possibility then of even more, well, if I can be there, I should be there. And that's kind of interesting. And just to come off the back of what you've said, I've also noticed as a freelancer, I've been freelance for 30 years. I have systems and ways of working and boundaries that I have seen other people not have. And that's because I've had to develop them in very much the same way, Becky, as you say, your organisation has developed them. I think freelancers have a whole bank of knowledge and the ability to work effectively at home and in a distributed or remote manner. That actually there's loads of knowledge and examples and tools and models of behaviour that we would do really, really well to mine, really.
I think I would second all of that. I think one of the things that a lot of organizations think that they are good employers, or think because everybody has good banter, or you might retain your staff for a long time, that you're a brilliant employer. But I think one of the things that this is showing is the absolute necessity to be a really dutiful, caring employer in terms of thinking about how your staff are feeling, what their motivation levels are. You really have to be on it in terms of empathy and finding ways of making sure that you are engaged with what the emotional well-being of your organization is. And part of that, I think, is also helping people to understand, particularly at the moment, you know, what you were saying, Becky, about what is urgent and what is actually important. And those are two very different things. And I think that comes back to trying to help people at this critical time understand what the real purpose and priorities are for what they should be working on. And that is about making sure that dialogue is open and making sure that they have time to create and think and be active, and they have time to process information, because that is something, those require two very different things going on in your head. And certainly in the last few weeks, a lot of people have been conscious of saying to me about, you know, how exhausted they are. But part of that is because there's just this onslaught of information, communication, not all of it urgent, or not all of it important, but all of it seemingly urgent, and trying to help people or give them the time to make sure that they are setting time aside to process as well as to actually do things.
I think I would just I'd just really add to Becky's reflection around structure, and certainly the way that I've worked for my whole career, also that understanding that freelance mentality, that, you know, if you're not careful, your day starts at 7:01 in the morning and, you know, ends at midnight, because your access to work has suddenly become whatever this is, 13 inches as a rectangle. So but I think that the way that for TV with location work has always worked is around that real clarity of expectation, and structure around when people need to know when they need to be delivering. So that sorts a little bit of the wheat from the chaff around the urgent versus important, because if those structures are in place at quite a sort of granular level, then everybody, it's not to say it makes it easy or streamlined, but everyone at least knows what's expected of them at what point. And that's certainly when you're working with those sort of that deadline orientated work that location filming throws up. You know, you have to work within this day, you have to finish at this time or you'll lose the light, or whatever the deadline is. The only way to make sure that those remote teams are actually able to deliver in a way that's functional and supportive is to have those structures, which are the kind of unsexy element of the creative industries. I think there's a natural resistance to them because they don't feel creative, they don't feel that they free things up. And actually I would disagree. I think it's absolutely opposite. I think those structures really do they create a sense of space and freedom for people to be able to stretch their wings because they understand what the boundaries are. So that would be my experience over many, many, many years, but also what I'm noticing now in relation to that sense of cohesiveness that I talked about earlier, that kind of the bringing together of fractured communities, is that when you have something as simple as a start time and an end time and an agenda or a schedule, suddenly everyone feels, oh, we can all relax a little bit, everyone can breathe out. So it sort of reduces stress, I think, and it sort of, well, for me as a parent, it kind of makes me, I'm familiar with how effective that can be.
I was talking to someone the other day who was saying that they are seeing less of their children at the moment than ever they did when they were traveling. And I also read an article, I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, that said that the number of research papers written by women during lockdown has plummeted, where the number of research papers written by men has increased. And I think that absolutely illustrates exactly what you've all been saying about there's a real danger that actually those the pressures on the people who are carrying that second shift, it's the second shift, you know, actually that at its very worst, these working practices bring the second shift to run concurrently with the first shift. It's bad enough when it's consecutive, but when it's concurrent, it's an absolute nightmare. And I think, you know, that it comes back to all of that stuff about leaving people behind, about we're not all in this together. This is hugely unequal in many, many ways, and we really need to be mindful of that as we review what of these recently adopted and for many of us learned practices, what we want to carry forward, and what actually is for now, but won't be appropriate for then. And what even for now we need to be reviewing, because it's really not working for a lot of people.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that actually, Michelle, because I do think that, you know, there is a democracy to this in the sense that the hierarchy is sort of flattened, but at the same time, and it sort of follows on from what Jeannie was saying, I think that having that emotional check-in with your teams is really important, because certainly in terms of our team, many people, you know, have been shielding for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks in one-bedroom flats. We have people obviously with, you know, small children. We have people who are in sharing, you know, houses with 7 people, trying to work in bedrooms. I mean, you know, I have an office, I have all my gear, I'm really well set up, but that is not, it is not an equal situation for anyone. And I think that one thing that we've been doing is every morning for an hour, I just go on Slack, I go and have a team call, and anyone can join if they want, just for a check-in, not for a chat, for a reflection, for a rant, for anything that is about life, not necessarily about work, or in fact never about work actually. And that's been really important, because it's allowed me some insight, and then we can start to make adjustments and keep making sure that people are able to do their best work in the time that they have available. And it's not for me to say what that time should be. And that's been a real test in a way of our model. It's been very much about not monitoring, it's not been about presenteeism, it's not been about anyone being scared of saying, actually, I can't do this right now. That has been absolutely a core bit of the conversation that's been going on. And that has not, unless people have requested to be furloughed, that has not resulted in furloughing.
Thank you. Becky, you mentioned earlier on, you sort of been talking about being a distributed organisation. And we've been talking about remote working. I wonder if you could just unpack the distinction in your mind between those two different terms for us.
So in my mind, I mean, we've tended historically, I think, or, you know, over the last period when we've been doing it, to use them slightly interchangeably. But I think that remote for me means that you're remote from somewhere. So for example, when I was working in a regional theatre and I worked from home, then I would be working remotely from the central office. But we don't have a central office, so I can't be remote from anywhere. In fact, I'm not remote, I'm in my office. But what I am part of is a distributed company. We're distributed geographically across, well, from London through to Gloucester, down to Brighton, across to Bristol. So we're distributed physically, but we also, I think in my mind, the key of a distributed company is that both the leadership and the responsibility is widely distributed, so that it's not an organisation where instruction happens. It's an organisation where people hold their work, and they are autonomous to quite a large degree within certain sort of cross-departmental teams. It's a much kind of more open working structure. There is some level of hierarchy in the sense that we have, obviously, you know, we're a charity, we have a board of trustees, we have a senior management team, but the people are absolutely encouraged to work to task and target, and to tell us what is and isn't reasonable, achievable, realistic in terms of their workload. And then we as an organisation, I suppose as a management team, our role is to adjust the load to the capacity rather than the other way around, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you. So you've talked about this, I think, a fair bit as we've been exploring. My next question was around kind of what are some of the practices and habits you've come across that work in your careers. You've alluded to many of those, and you've been talking about structures and clarity and boundaries. Are there other practices that we could just kind of rehearse and explore a little bit that you think have have proved themselves valuable. They've served the test of time in terms of ways of working in a more distributed or virtual environment. Jeannie? I can't hear you, Jeannie.
Sorry, following on from what Becky was saying, I think fundamentally trying to understand and know what it is that your staff are doing for you actually helps you to understand where you can give away power and where you need to, let people go off and do what they need to do, and where you need to bring people together. You actually need to have people together in the same virtual space to problem solve. And I think that's the difference between understand the kind of simple problems that every organization has to deliver, what are complicated problems that need a bit of working out, or kind of one, it might be two people working together on something, and what the complex problems are that actually everybody needs to be together and virtually sort of communicating visually as well to be able to solve them. And I think that actually helps from a management point of view to help you sort of distribute your time across a team most effectively as well. So you're not trying to micromanage absolutely everything. You don't need to be on top of absolutely every task that gets done. There are some things that people are perfectly capable of just getting on and doing on their own, and need a kind of, a small amount of check-in every now and again. So it's understanding how to deploy your time and your team's time together is a really useful thing. And having somebody to responsible at every one of those virtual meetings where everybody's together to manage time, because there is something about a virtual space where everybody is together chatting. Those Skype meetings or Zoom meetings can tend to go on quite a long time, and we all know, when you were working in offices, the dreaded sort of management meetings or things would go on forever. This is happening. This is a perfect opportunity to try and sort of hone that skill as an organization and make that hour that you have together online really sharp. Have somebody kind of keeping the meeting to time. And that is also a way of looking after your staff as well, because you're not keeping them tied to the 15-inch screen for 3, 4, 5 hours at a time and exhausting them. It's allowing them to do that bit of sharp thinking together, and then they go and do something else. So those are a couple of things, I think.
There's a sense I have at the moment that for lots of organisations, working virtually means being on Zoom all day, as if that's the only virtual tool that's available, if you like, or the only way of working. And as you say, it's an exhausting and fruitless experience. So what are some of those other sort of tools and resources or ways of working? I've heard talk about agile practices, and what's all of that stuff, and how do we use some of those approaches to work more effectively? Michelle?
Can I just say that I find it extraordinary that we seem to have forgotten about telephones.
I was just going to say, actually, I must say it's really important that we both understand that all the different variations around a tool like Zoom, for example, webinars, meetings, using the host function, chat, Q&A, etc., breakout rooms, but also that we keep remembering all the other tools. I mean, partly because, as we all know, Zoom's incredibly exhausting because of the delay and all of that, but also because for some people, this visual kind of communication, this amount of stimulation is not appropriate. And certainly in our organisation, I mean, we do keep coming back, and we find it a really useful question all the time to ask ourselves and each other is, what do you need to do your best work? And so, for example, for some people, I might say, actually, I'm doing this funding bid, can you write that section? For other people, I need to have a phone call with them about that section, because typing is not their preferred mode of communication. And particularly at the moment, some of the people in our team who are disabled don't have the support workers available so that, you know, that is an easy process, or the personal assistance. So making sure that you're choosing the right mode, not just for the encounter, but also for the person. And you know, on Friday, I think I was in an email correspondence with a potential partner, and I picked up the phone to her to have a chat, and it was just such a relief, you know, to get off the screen and move away. And it seems so simple, but we just have to make sure we're doing that, I think, for our own health as much as anything else, as well as for access.
Thank you. Any other comments around kind of tools, practices that we should be picking up on, Michelle?
It's not another tool specifically, but I just want to really emphasize and pick up on something Becky said earlier, that when we go back, whatever going back looks like, we mustn't forget all of this stuff, because it is the way that some people work best. It just is. So one of the habits, you talked about habits earlier, Richard, and one of the habits really is, for me, is humility and openness. That, you know, that way of working that for years we thought was the only way, well, suddenly we realize it really isn't. So can we maintain that openness and that humility? And apart from anything else, there are going to be, I think, probably a lot more people than many of us realize who are going to be at home for very much longer than the majority. And if we want them, and I assume that we do, if we want those people to be part of our cultural organizations, industries, ways of working, decision making, wonderful brilliance, then we need to retain some of this and learn even more ways of doing it.
Thank you. So I'm wondering a bit about.
Richard.
Oh, go on, Becky. Please do.
I was just saying, and it's another aspect of what Michelle was just talking about, but I also think it's about a new understanding of time. I mean, I think we're all encountering a bit of a new relationship to time at the moment, and the passing of time and the use of time. And I do think that as a sector, our working practice has been very old-fashioned in the way that we use time. And I think that's partly, you know, the way that we use time in the making of work is also incredibly inflexible and inhumane a lot of the time, and inaccessible. And I think that if we can start to think about our working practices and the way that we use each other's time and our own time more, with more you know, humility and kind of respect, I guess, I think that may have an incredibly positive knock-on in terms of our other working practices, in terms of the creation of work. Just an observation, really.
I think something to add to both Michelle and Becky there is thinking about how you're deploying teams to manage both of those. So thinking about setting up sort of cross-functional teams and bringing together people and making sure that people who might otherwise potentially feel isolated and certainly ongoing, making sure that they are included in kind of cross-functional projects is a way of keeping everybody tied together and everybody kind of linked into what the priorities are. But I think there's also something about how you culture those little teams and get them thinking about how they manage themselves that can help them to think about how they are managing their time, how they're looking after each other and helping each other get tasks done. And that way it's also, it kind of removes the sort of individual paranoia about delivering a task, and actually becomes, it's a collective, joint, collaborative process to achieve something or to get a thing done, which is going to benefit the organisation, rather than, and it's getting people out of that thing about, you know, their own little silo and getting things ticked off their own little action list. So I think there are some positive things there, just about simple things like how you structure little kind of groups and teams and set them tasks and pilot things over the next little while. That'll be quite useful for that.
And I think that there's something about the balance between autonomy and ownership and self-responsibility within a team and as an individual, balanced with taking the responsibility of leadership of a group. And it's that and that sort of cascading of responsibility through your structure feels that it needs, I mean, my experience tells me that needs thinking about. It doesn't happen as I think, you know, Michelle has said earlier, on the fly. It needs some proper focus and attention, not necessarily massively time consuming, but it needs thinking about, so that when it's executed, it flows, because that's ultimately what you want, is a flow, isn't it? You want a flow that feels like it sort of both carries people with it, but also expects everyone to paddle as well. So I think that balance is really important. Just picking up a bit on what Jeannie was saying.
Right, thank you. So I think we should soon sort of draw this conversation to a close, this panel to a close. I'm wondering if we can have a bit of a sort of closing conversation, either about that's about two things, I think. What can people and organisations do to equip themselves to have the most insightful conversations together, developing new practices, and are there some resources or tools or kind of processes that you'd recommend that might help people going forward? So how do people take some kind of structured action to collectively design some new ways of working, do you think?
I think one really important thing at this moment is to notice and review. I mean, so just in a really simple way, I think we're doing it much more than we had been doing it, because of the need to work obviously across companies with partners. But I think it's just important just to ask, how is this working for you? And to be really honest with each other about the pitfalls or the opportunities or the ways that it is and isn't functioning for individuals and teams. I mean, we're a very small organisation. It's probably relatively easy for us to have that conversation. But I just think if you can keep reviewing it, because what I've found is that, especially with our, the role is called company manager, but essentially, you know, she's systems manager, office manager, remote working manager, she's digital expert as well. She will have a solution. If something's not working, there is a solution, or there is some ways that we can work through it. But I think if you don't keep reviewing it and just go, this is what it is, then you won't discover what the other possibilities are.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I think definitely this is, I mean, everybody, even organisations that have been working more remotely or in a more agile way for some time, I think the last few weeks has tested everybody. And for some organisations or people who this is completely new to, might find it utterly exhilarating. They might be having a ball, a great time, and thinking, yes, more, how can I do more of this? For other people, it's been absolute hell, and there's a kind of massive learning curve. So I think absolutely, as Becky said, this is a point to really kind of stop and try and reflect on what it has been like, what has worked, what has been efficient, or what has been a surprise for the organisation. And at the same time, to test some of that sort of physiological strain, I suppose, what has been tiring, what has been exhilarating, what have we all really enjoyed? Has there been, particularly people in the organisation who have suddenly shone, who, have not had a chance before, and really try and pin down what those are. And I think the other thing is to really consider, well, if you're reflecting back on this and thinking, well, had we planned this as a pilot, we would be evaluating this now and thinking about what worked, what didn't work, and taking it forward. So rather than thinking, okay, it's all been a mad panic, is thinking, well, use this really constructively and think, well, how do we embed this way of working potentially in a more controlled way, maybe, about having a continual test and learn mentality within the organization, because that kind of iterative planning is what is going to be needed for some time to come. It's not a case of we're going to be out of this for 3-4 months and then everything goes back to normal. I think this kind of process of thinking, this testing, trialing, seeing what works, ditching what doesn't work, and actually being brave about taking a next step forward is going to be something that is going to stand organizations in good stead in the long term. And so that's a muscle that people need to get used to, I think, and start working more effectively.
I couldn't agree more with Jeannie. I think it is that thing about sort of subtle but significant change. So it's iterative small changes. It's much easier for everyone to cope with that than saying, this is our massive handbrake turn. And you hear the engine whining and everyone kind of go, So I think that, but it is critically about taking action. And I think that's where the leadership element comes in, because we can take in all that feedback and that reflection, but at the end of that day or that meeting or whatever your structure is, someone has to say, right, okay, so this is what we're going to do next time. And I think that in the discursive space, there has to be that, what are our action points and who is responsible for those action points, so that when we come back together, we review how it has moved on. And I think that's one of the challenges with everything that's new, is there's so much reflection and there's so much sort of like, shared understanding, that can become a little bit, what's the right word? It can become a bit introspective as well. So I think that it's really about, so going back to the thing I said earlier about structure and schedule, doesn't sound very sexy, but it gives you a point where you have to stop and say, right, how are we going to move on?
Great, thanks, Hannah.
Michelle? I think there are two specific tools actually which can be really, really useful. One is the good old SWOT analysis. It's always a great first go-to, isn't it? What are the strengths of the ways that we've been working, the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats? I think that is a great first layer of review. And the other one that I think could be quite interesting is a kind of the story of change tool or theory of change tool, which is usually prospective, it's usually forward, it's future looking. What would a retrospective kind of theory of change analysis of what's gone on in the last 2 months look like, so that you could then pick and choose on the basis of, well, actually we can see that this led to that, and that's really good. So if we do more of that into our forward thinking, that would be a good thing, and that obviously led to that which is not good, so let's take that out of the action. So I think there are two really basic tools that could be very, very useful.
Really nice, thank you. People Make It Work has a tool called the Re5 model, which looks at how we reacted, which is about, kind of closing down and responding to the shock, how we responded, the sort of proactive, conscious decisions the organisation made, then a moment of reflection, then reimagining, and then reshaping. I think you can apply the Re5 tools that you'll find on our website to this very question. It's not only about what we're making, it's about how we're working. And there's lots of reflection structure in there as well, if that's useful, beyond all the other things that people have suggested. So this video is part of a month-long inquiry, really, into reframing and reshaping the ways that we're working as organisations and teams. It will be both in the change creation cohort space, as well as on our People Make It Work website. And during the month, we'll have new tools and resources and experiences that we'll be working through in order to support you in thinking about and remodeling the ways that you work in your organisation. Those tools will appear on the People Make It Work website within days of being produced, and they'll appear in the change creation programme for that cohort. Right now, I'd like to thank Michelle, Hannah, Jeannie and Becky for joining us for this panel, and thank you for spending time with us exploring this question. Thanks very much indeed.